Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Tech Meme Ride Home, a new podcast covering the technology stories of the day and the iOS app AutoWake 2. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hi, John. How are you?
I'm doing real well today. We've got a lot to talk about today. Do you think we should just maybe dive in with a little follow-up from our iOS default apps last week?
Okay, what did you do that deserved some follow-up here?
Well, I assumed that when I couldn't use Command-Z to undo closing a tab in Safari on iOS, that it wasn't possible. It turns out it is possible. There's more than one way to do it on the Mac, and I've always used Command-Z, and I'd forgotten that you can do Shift-Command-T, which, Command-T is to open a tab.
That's right.
Shift-Command-T is to reopen a tab. And that one works on iOS, but the other one doesn't. But to me, this is also kind of one of those things that I'd like to see a little more standardization between the Mac and iOS, especially for people like me who move back and forth. I saw Dan Seifert of The Verge, he's a senior editor of The Verge, mentioned the other day that he thought, things like spacebar to scroll should be standardized in iOS apps when you have a keyboard attached. And I like that idea because I'd like to, every time I go into an app with the table view, be able to just hit the space bar and kind of move down the page without having to, reach out and scroll up and down.
Yeah, and I should have thought of the shortcut because I'm pretty sure that I actually talked about this in one of my iOS reviews.
You probably did.
It's just that, over time you start losing track of all these tiny features that you talk about, even from a couple of years ago. I think this was added with iOS 9.
Okay.
So that would be 3 years ago at this point. So I think I'm forgiven. At least I'm forgiving myself.
Well, I'm going to forgive myself for using a different method on the Mac.
Yeah.
But now I learned something, which I appreciate our listeners telling me that, because now I know what to do when I'm on my iPad.
All right. The topic that we want to talk about today, it's something that I think has been on our minds for a while. We talked about this idea of, how do you want to call it, self-control when using smartphones?
Yeah, I think so.
Screen time. There's a lot of talk these days about this movement, which is an actual organization called Time Well Spent, which is the idea of we should limit the time that we spend using smartphones, that we spend on social media, just mindlessly scrolling through our Facebook and Instagram and Twitter feeds. Sort of this idea, this concept of we should look at the real world more and less at a screen. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot this year. I've been trying to cut back, especially on social media and especially on Twitter and Facebook, because I felt like on one hand, they were not good for my mood on a daily basis, just all this horrible news and people, sending you all kinds of comments. And I thought, I'm just wasting my time here. I could probably be okay with less Twitter and less Facebook in my life. But also, I've been trying to spend more time around people and talking to my friends and hanging out with friends, and less about, just saying, I don't want to go out. I'm just going to spend a couple of hours on the couch just browsing Twitter or watching YouTube videos. And it's been a struggle, honestly, because I'm so used to, pick up my smartphone and my iPhone and do something, look at something, because it's easy. It's a passive consumption. You don't really think about it. And I've made a conscious effort to understand this, because I see it as a bad habit, sort of like smoking, really.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that you do without even thinking about it once you're addicted to just opening Facebook or opening Twitter. Have you felt the same way about this stuff?
Yeah, I really have. And I notice it now and then when a lot of people in our tech group get together and we'll be in a room together and everybody's just doing their own thing on their phone, which is kind of sad when you think about it.
Yes.
I noticed it a little bit when we were all at Release Notes last year, right? In the fall in Chicago. And it's like, well, most of us don't see each other more than once, maybe twice a year. That's the kind of time you really should put that kind of thing away, because you should be spending time with the people who presumably you're there to see in the first place. And so I've tried to do a lot of that myself. It's hard because I think I noticed it the most when I started time tracking, because I don't do the thing where I track how much I'm wasting time on things like Twitter, but I do track the hours that I work. And when I get to the end of the day, and I've been air quotes working for 12 hours, but I've only logged like 8 hours of actual productive work, I know that I'm screwing around on Twitter and whatever else there might be. And that's just too much time to just kind of throw away in a day. So I've tried to do the similar things, turned off all the notifications on Twitter, actually close the app during the day and dip back in periodically, that sort of thing, just to kind of reduce it, not eliminate it, but give it a kind of defined area of the day.
And I think it's an interesting discussion when it comes to trying to understand who's to blame or where the problem lies. If it's the smartphone itself and the operating system and the features of the smartphone, or if it's us, if we as users are so easily fooled by the allure of these social media feeds and phones and games and apps. And it's something that I want to talk about. So I've sort of split this section and these thoughts in two categories. From a technical perspective, I think that companies that make smartphones, so Apple and Google and even social media companies like Facebook and Twitter, I don't think they've done enough to help us control our addiction to screens and to social feeds. And I think they are only realizing now that this has become a problem. So there's a few issues that I wanted to bring up with you, John. The first one is that especially on iOS, I think Android is doing better than iOS. The notification controls on iOS are terrible, honestly.
Yeah.
They are too simple. There's no deep control over what is able to send us a notification or not. And even if you look at iOS 11, right? So you have an OS that doesn't offer a system to group notifications together so that when you open your notification view, you get this insanely long list of unorganized notification alerts, which takes time to get through, which is more time that you're spending on your smartphone. And also, it doesn't really help you summarize what is going on. So when you're scrolling, you're picking up different threads, you're picking up different messages, and it's not a user-friendly way to show you all these messages and all these interruptions. Also, iOS doesn't offer any system to group similar notifications together. So on Android, for example, developers of Android apps, they can say this is a sort of like a status update, or this is a private message type of notification. And they have different types of controls for those notifications, because maybe, for example, you want to have an alert from a private message from someone important. But if it's just a status update about John has posted a picture in your timeline, maybe I don't want to know about that right away.
Right.
So a way to differentiate between important notifications and everything else, I think that could be really useful to have. And finally, again, especially on iOS, we've seen so many times how developers can abuse the system and send you spammy notifications for stuff that really shouldn't be, according to Apple's own guidelines, shouldn't be a notification at all. Like something like your engine is ready. You can now go back and play your racing game, or buy a sack of gems today for 99 cents. All these spammy promotional messages that try to get you back into using an app or playing a game. And that's exactly the problem, because you get the message, and we as humans, we cannot resist the temptation, and so we open the app again, and we're still looking at the screen, and we're missing out on whatever is going on outside.
I feel like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here for Apple to grab. For instance, I know you guys talked about this a little bit on Connected a couple of weeks ago. Things like, Mike, I know, was raising the issue where he doesn't want to see a notification while he's watching a video in the evening and relaxing. And I completely get that. I don't want to get a notification while I'm playing Alto's Odyssey, even if I'm just goofing off with that. But I think beyond that, there are all sorts of notification limitations that could be, and do not disturb rules that can be employed. Things like location-based stuff. Maybe there's a place you go that you don't want to be bothered no matter what when you go there. Or maybe you're going out with friends for an evening and you've got it on your calendar, and you don't want to be bothered while you're sitting at dinner with your friends. So calendar-based notifications and do not disturb rules would be fantastic, I think.
Yeah.
And I agree with you on those spammy notifications. I don't know why Apple hasn't enforced this. This has never been enforced. Ever since push notifications were first debuted, it's never been very well policed. And I can only imagine it's because they don't have a good way to do it, because the volume, I don't remember what it is, but there was, I think at one of the keynotes at some point, Apple threw out how many push notifications they were sending, like 1 billion a day or something like that. It was some extraordinarily large number, and they probably don't have the tools. That doesn't really excuse it, because I don't think we should be getting advertisements pushed at us. But I suspect that it's a technical issue as well, more than anything else.
Yeah, it's a tough problem to solve, but at least, for example, Google is doing something about it, and it would be nice to see Apple trying to get into the same game and trying to improve how the system works. You mentioned Do Not Disturb, which is another system feature of iOS that I think should be improved with more granular controls, more ways to say, I don't want to get notifications when I'm working out or when I'm watching a movie, or for example, yes, when I'm out with friends and I'm having dinner, if you see that I'm at the restaurant, then maybe you should infer that I don't want to see notifications from YouTube telling me that Casey Neistat has a new video. Sounds like really simple stuff, but it's really a problem. I've seen people get notifications while sitting at the restaurant table and, just spending time together, getting notifications from YouTube and opening YouTube
and start watching the video.
Watching video at the restaurant. Come on. Yes, arguably the problem is the person, but also it's the OS that is telling you. And it's a fascinating ethical problem, really. Should the OS tell you that someone you care about on YouTube has a new video, while also knowing that you are at the restaurant and likely spending time with other people? If you think about it, it's a question of, should DOS have feelings, in the sense of, should DOS decide what is best for you? Which is why this discussion gets really tricky when you start considering, should this be something that you set beforehand? Should it be automatic? I think it should be, all these controls that we mentioned, notifications, do not disturb. I think most people would be comfortable with them if they were enabled by default, but if the OS also told you. Something like do not disturb while driving, for example. I'm pretty sure that it's on by default, but iOS tells you so that you know. It's not like a surprise.
Right.
Maybe you do want to know when a video is out, despite the fact that you're eating a pizza.
Right. And that's the thing, is that people have different priorities, right? So there may be a set of defaults that Apple can pick, but then they should be tweakable so that you can adjust things to the way you operate. Now, there's all kinds of things. I was suggesting things like calendar do not disturb rules, but you can also have people rules, right? You may want to hear from your girlfriend no matter what when she text messages you or something like that. So you could almost create a hierarchy. Some of this is kind of done now with VIPs, but it's just not very granular, and it doesn't account for every situation where you might have a friend who you want to hear from on the weekend no matter what, but if you're in the middle of a meeting in the morning at work, you may not want to hear from that friend. There's different circumstances and contexts that have to be taken into account when you're setting up these rules. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by TechMeme Ride Home, a new podcast covering the technology stories of the day. TechMeme.com has already earned a reputation as the place to find out what you've missed in the world of tech, collecting the very best of the tech news from around the web. And now TechMeme brings their love of technology to a brand new podcast. The show is called TechMeme Ride Home, and it's hosted by Brian McCullough, who you might know from the Internet History Podcast. Brian seriously knows his stuff. Throughout his career, he's interviewed a ton of entrepreneurs, engineers, and other people who've made the internet era happen. It's a background that shines through on Ride Home, providing context and insight to every story. New episodes of TechMeme Ride Home are released every weekday, making it a fantastic way to keep up to date with the headlines. Plus, here's some interesting expert commentary on the world of tech. The show is only 15 to 20 minutes long and released every day at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, making it the perfect complement to your commute home in the evening. Open up your podcast app right now and search for TechMeme Ride Home. Hit the subscribe button while you're there so you don't miss the latest episode. Our thanks to TechMeme for their support of the show.
Oh, there's also another point that I wanted to make, that for as much as we complain about all these games that they have time limits, they are freemium games, and they do stuff like, well, now you can play for 10 minutes, then you gotta wait 25 minutes, and then you can come back and play some more, unless you want to pay actual money. Those games, everybody's complaining about them, but we should remember that Apple and Google and all these other big companies, they heavily promoted these games. So it's kind of ironic when these companies are now talking up the benefits of time well spent and not looking at your phone, while they are also running app stores that constantly promote these games. So there's like contrasting incentives, really, of we want to do what's best for our users, but also we need to make money with the app stores, and we need to take our commission of people sucking up to the game and buying gems.
I agree. Those things are fundamentally in conflict, and that's why I think at the end of the day, the users are the ones that have to be in control of what the notifications are.
So Google I/O was a couple of weeks ago, and they showed this feature that is coming to Android P, is the next version, I think, which is a dashboard to see which apps you're using, how much you're using your phone on a daily basis. And it gives you a breakdown of what you're doing, how much time you're spending on Facebook, for example, or YouTube, which is a fascinating feature. I think it's, I talked about this on Connected. I think I would love to have something like this on iOS, because it's kind of like Rescue Time on the Mac, for example, where you can monitor which apps you're using, and maybe those numbers, seeing the hard reality of how much you're actually using your phone, maybe it can be some kind of motivation for you. And the idea of motivation is ultimately what makes me believe that even though the mobile OSs are not perfect and they haven't helped us get a better control of our habits, I think ultimately it's up to us to understand that, if you're at the restaurant and there's sitting at the table with a bunch of friends, maybe you shouldn't be looking at your phone all the time.
Right.
I think, yes, it's fine to criticize Apple and Google and Facebook and Twitter, but ultimately we are the ones grabbing the phone and looking at it. And I think we need to accept the fact that it's an addiction. It's not as, it doesn't kill people the same way that smoking or drinking does, but it's a kind of addiction, which is fun. Honestly, it's fun, right? Because you go on YouTube and you play a game and you talk to people on Twitter. It's fun, right? It's got that type of, it gives you a little kick. It's fun to do. But it's also kind of wrong when you think about it. And I think understanding that it's a problem is, I don't want to say 50% of the solution, but honestly, since I started thinking about this stuff and not trying to say, well, the OS doesn't tell me how much time I'm spending on Twitter, then there's nothing I can do about it. I don't think it's right. I think we need to accept that it's up to us to make a decision and make a change.
Yeah, I feel similarly about those tools. I think it would be good to have tools to tell you exactly how much time you're spending in different apps. But, the reality is I might be in messages texting you about some project we're working on 1 minute and sending a skeleton sticker to Steven the next minute, right? And those two things are very different in the same app. And no tool is going to tell me which one I was wasting time on, which one was a valuable use of my time, right?
Right.
That's really on me to figure out.
How do you use time tracking from this point of view? Because all I do is I track the time I spend on Twitter, because that's the biggest problem that I have. I spend way too much time on Twitter. It doesn't help that I've always been a timeline completionist. I need to see every tweet in my timeline. I'm not sure how I feel about this, because on one hand, Twitter has been a great help for my job over the years, because it allowed me to get to know a lot of developers, find out about new apps or news to cover on the site. But lately, I feel like being a completionist is more bad than efficient for me at this point.
Yeah, I'm very conflicted about Twitter in particular too, because I agree with you. It's a valuable resource both for finding out things that we can write about. I mean, yes, a lot of people get in touch with us anyway, so we don't really have to rely on it. But there are things that come up from time to time. If you keep your eye on Twitter, I feel like I have a better context for where things are going and what apps are coming and what people in general are working on, so that when I, say, we do a club interview with somebody, I know what a lot of these developers are working on without having actually talked to them, just because I follow them on Twitter, that sort of thing. So and there's value to that. And that's a good argument for being a completionist. On the other hand, I just don't have enough time in the day to do that anymore, at least regularly. Like, so yesterday was a day where it was like, I don't know, I got to Twitter at some point and I had 300 unread tweets in my timeline. And I just scrolled to the top. It's like, I don't, I just don't have, there's not enough hours in the day to deal with this. So yeah, as far as time tracking goes, I don't track my time on Twitter, but I do track everything else. And as I said, a little earlier, if I get to, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 in the afternoon, early evening, and I maybe only worked 6 hours, I know something's wrong because I start pretty early, and I know that I've been screwing around with something. And that's when I usually sit and reflect a little bit about what I've been messing around with during the day and try to avoid that in the future. So I don't track it strictly, but it is pretty easy to look back on a day and figure out which days were productive days and which ones were John spent a little too much time fiddling around on Twitter that day. Thanks to AutoWake 2 for sponsoring App Stories this week. AutoWake is the newest member of the family of iOS apps that includes HeartWatch and AutoSleep. AutoWake was developed because users of AutoSleep and HeartWatch wanted a smart alarm for the Apple Watch that wakes you gently from lighter sleep using haptics. Here's the thing. Being woken up from lighter sleep means you're more relaxed and less groggy, and that's always a good thing. Being woken up by being tapped on the wrist is less stressful than an audible alarm, and it won't wake up your partner. Once you've been woken up with haptics, you won't want to go back to the old way, especially when you're woken up at the smartest time, which is within 15 to 30 minutes of the alarm time you set. Getting this to work in a reliable way with little battery drain on the Apple Watch in a simple, easy-to-use way was a big challenge and required a new approach. A simple, bare-bones version of AutoWake was released in December. AutoWake 2 is currently in app review and will be available soon with great new sophisticated features like a daily schedule with auto activation, bedtime reminders, integration with the AutoSleep app, snooze, HomeKit scenes for key events, custom haptics for both the alarm and to optionally help bring you out of a deeper sleep via a light tap on the wrist in the window before your alarm. AutoWake even takes your waking heart rate just before you get up. This gives you a great insight into your wellness. AutoWake 2 will be available very soon on the App Store for just $2.99 US. If you buy AutoWake 1 today for the price of only $1.99, you'll get AutoWake 2 for free when it comes out. So go check it out right now. You can find out more details at autowake.tansissa.com. There'll be a link in the show notes. AutoWake has a special offer just for App Stories listeners. The first 11 folks who tweet at the AutoWake app Twitter account with the code word espresso will receive a free promo code. Thanks again to AutoWake 2 for supporting the show.
So let me ask you this now. You have kids.
Yep.
What's the family angle here?
There are a lot of angles, and I think one of the things that we're beating around the bush a little bit on a couple of different issues that come up. One is just the amount of time that you spend with mobile devices or screens, whatever they happen to be. And the other is the quality of the time you spend while you're on them. And those things are somewhat useful to separate in your mind because I think too much of anything is not a good thing, no matter what it is. Even if you're, doing something that would otherwise be viewed as valuable, if you're doing it too many hours a day, that's not good. So there's those kind of limits that I think as a parent in particular, you try to set and avoid your kids spending too much time doing one thing. But then there's also the qualitative thing, and I run into parents sometimes, especially when my kids were younger, I would run into parents who are like, oh, I just don't let them use any iOS devices, period, or computers. These are bad for them. And that's easy. There's no doubt that's an easy route to take, but I don't think it really is that simple because I've watched my kids do everything from want to play hours and hours of Call of Duty, which I don't find a particularly good way to spend your time.
No.
To learning how to create iOS apps, right? Which I think is good. Or, so you can take an iPad and you can learn Swift, or you could read a book. Or you could just play Candy Crush all day. Those are just very different activities. It's not the easiest approach to dealing with this stuff, but I personally have tried more than anything to steer them as much as I can to more productive stuff when they're doing that, with the understanding that it's okay to have fun too. You just have to, it's got to be within boundaries.
So in terms of finding a solution to these problems, and there are multiple issues here, I think there's the simple fact that we're constantly looking at our phones, but also if you dig into that, as you mentioned, you may be working on your phone or you may be looking at something on Facebook. So there's the issue of we are addicted to social media because we cannot control ourselves. We have that habit of constantly checking for likes or for comments. And I know that I have the problem. I've had the problem in the past, and I'm trying to do better. But I recognize that the social media addiction is a real thing. But also, there's the other issue of if you use your phone for work, then why are you doing work stuff when you're not supposed to? So that's another
Right.
problem, right? Especially for self-employed people.
Absolutely.
You have your email always with you, and something comes in, then what do? You don't respond to a really important business email? Of course you respond. So that's that's another issue. These big companies like Apple and Google and others, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, are all trying to come together on this idea behind the time well spent movement and trying to do something about the fact that we're using our phones too much and we're looking at our phones too much. And I don't know why everybody's now talking about this stuff. I think it's a mix of problems. It's the, just where the world is going from a political standpoint and the role that social media and the internet played in, for example, in politics everywhere, basically,
Right.
not just in the US, but everywhere. And all the problems with fake news and cyberbullying and trolling and, just hateful comments on social media. All these problems have come together into this big bowl of issues with using our smartphones because it's what everybody's using. And I think a bunch of problems have come together under the same sort of movement, which is fascinating to observe. And I wonder how it will evolve over time. It's not, I think, the more I think about it, I don't think it's a black and white situation in that, yes, we should stop using our phones because phones are bad. Because, of course, we know, because we read about them and we see them, we know the benefits of using smartphones for many different purposes, from doing work wherever you are, to exercising, to meditating, to getting in touch with parents and kids. Of course, smartphones can be good for us, can be great for us. They are the best computers we've ever owned. So it's a discussion of balance, and it doesn't have a single solution. That's why I welcome, Google when they're trying to do something, because if we do nothing, the problem is not gonna change, and it's only gonna get worse. But if we do something, even if it's not a magic fix, it's something, and I think that's useful to have.
Yeah, I agree. It's, at the end of the day, smartphones are tools, right? And they can be used for good purposes or bad purposes. I mean, it's remarkable that in today's day, you and I can work together from the US and Italy.
Exactly.
And that wouldn't have been possible not that long ago, really. So there are a lot of benefits and a lot of good that comes from it, but it can definitely be overdone. And I think, one of the things when you're dealing with people in your life, whether it's friends or family or whatever, is that to them, I always try to keep in mind that to people around me, if I'm on my phone, they don't really know, is John just working too much, right? Is John just still working on that latest story for Mac Stories or texting with Federico?
Yeah.
Or is he playing Candy Crush? They don't know. For
them,
it's
play Candy Crush?
No, I don't play Candy Crush. I do not play Candy
Good
Crush.
to know. Good to know. Okay.
But here's the thing. I mean, they just don't know. They'll assume that maybe he's working longer than he should, or maybe he's just fooling around longer than he should. But they don't really know, and it doesn't really matter to them because either way, whether you're playing Candy Crush or working on an email, it's still time away from the people in your life. So I think it's important to kind of, especially if it's something that's important, if it really is like a work thing that you have to do and there's just no getting around it, then I think communication is the way to deal with that, to let people around you know that, hey, I'd rather not be doing this, but I have to deal with this right now, so that they know that it's just something you have to deal with, as opposed to just sitting there idly on the couch scrolling through your timeline.
So as possible solutions, we mentioned having better notification settings and controls, having better do not disturb options as well, so that you
Right.
can have more granular preferences over when you can be disturbed and from what. I also want to mention, I mean, besides just having some self-control and self-respect and understanding that you're spending time with friends and then or family, and maybe it's best to look at somebody else in the eye and talk to them and enjoy spending time together instead of looking at a screen and people telling you things on Twitter or Instagram. Besides that, I also would like to say that I think there's a lot of potential in detaching from the smartphone using another device, such as a smartwatch, such as the Apple Watch. I think there's a lot of potential, especially with the Apple Watch that is now cellular for some of us, not for me. But
Yep.
the idea of having a tiny computer that can, for emergencies or for important conversations, it's always with you, but it removes the temptation of scrolling Twitter or opening Facebook because you can't.
Right.
I think that's a powerful idea. And going forward, I think apps should explore this possibility of the Apple Watch as a tiny iPhone that allows you to do navigation and music and exercise and messaging without the risk of spending time, a couple of hours on Facebook and constantly checking your timeline while you're eating out with friends. I think that's a powerful idea.
Yeah, and I've actually employed that in a little different way sometimes too, which is just getting out a pen and paper and planning out a day or a week or whatever it happens to be in a notebook. Because the thing is, I can open up things and start tapping away about all and looking at all the things I need to do in the upcoming days. But then that Twitter notification might come in, or I might get an email, or I might get a text, whatever it happens to be. But if I just put that stuff away, sit down, and plan out my day, that can be a lot more productive in a shorter amount of time. All right, Federico, I think that's a good place to stop today. Hopefully, maybe we've inspired some people to set some limits on the screen time that they have. You can find our show notes at appstories.net. I want to thank our sponsors again, TechMeme Ride Home and AutoWake 2. And you can find Federico and I every week writing on MacStories.net and for Club Mac Stories. And on Twitter, Federico is at Viticci, that's Viticci, and I'm at John Voorhees, JohnVoorhees. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.